Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Georgina and I'm the childminder behind the Young Ones Childminding. My practice is very much rooted in child-led learning, emotional well-being, connection, understanding childhood all through a relational lens. So today we're going to be talking about transitions, particularly some of the larger transitions that children experience, such as starting school and settling into new settings. At this time of year, especially, transitions become a huge focus within early years practice. Many children are preparing to leave their familiar environments and begin school, while others are preparing to enter early years settings for the first time. Alongside this, some children may also be experiencing wider changes within their family or relationships. And what I really hope today is that we can move beyond simply seeing transitions as those practical processes and begin to think a little bit more about the emotional experience beneath them. Because for children, transitions are rarely just events, they are emotional experiences, and the way that children feel during these experiences matters so deeply. So let me just pop on session aims. Okay, so today I really would like us to explore those transitions through the child's perspective and reflect on how periods of change can impact both children and families emotionally. We'll spend some time reflecting and thinking about some practical ways that we can support children starting school and those settling into new settings, but also how strong relationships, emotionally responsive practice, partnership, um, and working together with others can help children feel safe within those experiences. I'd really love this session to feel reflective for you all. So please feel free to pop any thoughts or questions into the chat. And as we mentioned earlier, there'll be an opportunity at the end where we'll stop recording for any further conversations that you might want to have. So here we go. Um, so I'm going to ask you all before we get started, what comes to mind when you think of transitions? And I'd love you all if you just pop one word in the chat if anything springs to mind. So when you're thinking about transitions, think of one word that comes into your mind. Change, yeah, that's a great one. Another change, yeah. Oceans, yeah. New fear, challenges, anxiety, all great words. Big step. So all those sort of words such as change and uncertainty, excitement, anxiety, growth, overwhelm, challenge, all those sort of words and emotions come up. And I think those words all tell us something really important because transitions often hold many emotions at once, not only for children, but for families, practitioners, and even ourselves as we go through change in life. All those words that we've just described come up for us too. Um, and I think it's important for us to all remember that because sometimes transitions are spoken about very practically, we often talk about like routines, visits, paperwork, timelines, preparation. But underneath all of that are real emotional experiences that children are trying to navigate. So, one of the things I think are really important to recognize is that transitions are not isolated only to those big moments that we focus on, the ones that we've just been discussing, those big moments of change, but children experience transitions constantly throughout everyday life. I won't focus too much on that today, but it's something I really wanted to mention because it's something I feel quite strongly about. Children experience transitions constantly. They're moving between activities, separating from parents on a morning or leaving us on an afternoon or whenever your sessions finish, coming from indoors to outdoors, changes in routines, moving between rooms or changes in caregivers if you've got multiple people working at your setting. All of these experiences are asking children to adapt emotionally in some way. And over time, these smaller experiences begin to shape how children understand change itself. They, sh they shape whether or not the child is feeling predictable, or uncertain, safe or overwhelmed, supported or rushed. So while today we are focusing particularly on those larger transitions, such as school transitions and settling in, I do think it's really important that we hold in mind that transitions are layered, they are ongoing, and they're deeply relational experiences for children, even those things that seem quite minor to us as adults, they feel quite big to children. So, as adults, we often approach transitions with future focused thinking. We know school is coming. Far before we approach the subject with children, we know children will likely settle eventually. We understand the purpose of change. But children are experiencing in the here and now. And for many children, transitions involve unfamiliar environments, unfamiliar adults, new routines, new sensory demands, separation from attachment figures, and uncertainty about what's coming next. That is a huge emotional load for a young child to carry. And I often think if we imagine ourselves walking into a completely new environment, or unfamiliar environment where we maybe don't know anyone or don't know expectations, we don't know the routines, or everyone just assumes we'll adapt quickly. But we can begin to understand how vulnerable transitions can feel for children because even as adults, those things can feel quite big to us. This understanding is closely connected to the attachment theory and the work of John Bowlby, who emphasized the importance of children having that secure base from which they can explore the world. Now, when children are feeling emotionally safe and connected to trusted adults, they're far more able to navigate uncertainty and adapt to change and engage confidently within new environments. During periods of transition, periods of transition, they need emotional security, and that need often becomes more significant than it does at other parts of their lives. And I think this is where our role as emotionally available adults becomes incredibly, incredibly important. So, behavior as communication. Transitions often show themselves through behavior. So obviously, we know that children can act out of character when they have transitions going on in their lives, whether they're the big ones that we're talking about tonight or other ones. Children may become clingier, more emotional, feel more dysregulated or show signs of dysregulation, be withdrawn, oppositional, maybe quieter than usual, or seeming regressive, and going back to earlier stages that they've previously moved past. Things like we might see toileting changes, sleep disruptions, which I know even for the older children, we might not see it there and then, but parents might communicate that with us that they're having disrupted sleep. Increased emotional outbursts, or children becoming more controlling and needing that predictability. And I think it's really important that we all reframe these responses because these are not children who are intentionally trying to, give us a hard time. They are children who are communicating that something feels emotionally demanding to them. Behavior during transitions is often that communication before it's anything else. And sometimes what we really need to be hearing underneath the behavior is, this feels big. I don't feel safe yet. I need connection and I don't know what to expect. So when we begin to view behavior through that lens, our response is often softened too. We might move away from that trying to manage the behavior and towards that trying to understand the emotional need behind it, which I think is really, really important for both us as practitioners and for the children who are experiencing it. Oh, sorry. Ah, mouse isn't clicking. So, what the child may be trying to communicate. I think one of the most powerful reflective questions we can ask ourselves during transitions is, what might the child be trying to communicate emotionally? Because often behaviors become to make much more sense when we consider that emotional load behind it. Um, for example, if a child's refusing to separate, they might be communicating that fear or uncertainty. A child who's becoming more controlling may be actually seeking predictability and safety. And a child withdrawing may actually be feeling emotionally overwhelmed. Or a child becoming angry might really be feeling dysregulated and anxious, and that's how they're trying to express it. Many children simply do not have the language or the emotional understanding and intelligence to fully explain those feelings. So instead, they try and show us. Now, this is throughout periods of transition, not purely those big ones. And I think this is why emotionally responsive practice matters so much, particularly during times of transition, because children are often trying to communicate emotionally long before they have the ability and the um, way to verbalize it clearly. For younger children, things like Makaton and using sign can help. Obviously, it's all about knowing your children and how you can support them. And as they get older, helping them work through that. Now, of course, we've been talking today particularly about two main transitions, but there are obviously other significant transitions that children may experience. While school transitions are the main focus, we really need to acknowledge that there are other big significant transitions too. Things like this could be bereavement, family separations, divorce, moving house, new siblings, changes in family structures. Even things like practitioner changes, if you're a setting that's got several practitioners, maybe some assistants and some leave, things like that can feel quite significant, particularly if they were quite connected to that practitioner. Um, or changes in caregivers. Again, that can be at home. I know some of my own young ones that I look after have grandparents involved quite a lot, and if there's any changes with that, that can disrupt them and feel like quite a big transition for them. Um, Sometimes some of these things and these types of transitions can be underestimated because they might not always appear outwardly dramatic to adults, but emotionally they can feel enormous for children. Now, obviously, some of the things we've mentioned, even as adults, we all deal with things differently, particularly grief, bereavement. Everybody handles things differently. But there are those things that seem lesser to us as adults, but feel quite big for children. And I'm at the moment, I'm in the process of hopefully moving house, and not just for my children, but for us as adults, it's stressful because a lot of these things are some of the most stressful things that you experience in life. And particularly for children, not all transitions are chosen or expected or celebrated, but all transitions are experienced emotionally. And often during periods of change, children need consistency, predictability, emotional availability, and reassurance, and connection more than ever. Sometimes very small things such as familiar songs, repeated stories, emotionally available adults, familiar routines that they come to expect become incredibly regulating during those times of uncertainty. So let's move on to starting school. This time of year, especially, school transitions become such a huge focus within early years practice, and understandably so. Starting school is one of the biggest transitions that many young children experience. But I do think sometimes in these conversations about school readiness, we can unintentionally become very focused on outcomes and expectations rather than the emotional experience that's underneath the transition itself. And let's face it, our role in early years is to prepare children for life, not just school. Um, we talk about whether children can recognize their name, manage their belongings, sit for what will be carpet time, or separate confidently. And while those practical skills absolutely support children emotionally, emotional security matters just as much, if not more, in my personal opinion, substantially more. because children do not need to arrive at school already coping fully independently with every emotional demand placed upon them, but they do need to feel safe enough to learn, safe enough to build relationships, safe enough to navigate change, and that's where we come in. Research from the Education Endowment Foundation highlights the importance of children's personal, social, and emotional development in supporting long-term learning and well-being. Emotional security is not separate from learning, it underpins it until a child feels emotionally safe, they are not ready to learn. But when children feel supported, connected, secure, they are far more able to regulate, engage, communicate, and approach new experiences with confidence. And I think this is where we, as early years professionals, have such an important role. We're not simply preparing children academically for school, we're supporting them emotionally through one of the biggest transitions in early childhood. And what a privilege it is to have the ability to make such a positive impact on children. So, one of the things I always encourage is preparing children through play. Now, I'm a big advocate for play-based learning, and when children are learning through play rather than pressure, it gives children a safe emotional space to process experiences that they may otherwise feel overwhelming or uncertain, sorry. Often before a big transition, we might notice children revisiting themes that connect to that experience within their play. They might become fascinated with uniforms or repeatedly role playing like goodbye routines, like lining up chairs in a classroom or asking the same sort of questions about school repeatedly over and over again. And I think these moments are really important because often this is the child trying to gain a sense of understanding and a sense of control over something that feels emotionally big. Within our environments, we can gently be supporting this by weaving that transition and those themes naturally into children's play. So that might mean adding school uniforms into role play areas, maybe introducing some backpacks so they can wear little backpacks, creating small world scenes or giving the option for them to access the resources to do that. Reading stories about starting school. There's so many lovely books that, incorporate school-based settings or starting school. Or simply allowing children space to revisit those ideas repeatedly in their own way. I know my little ones at the moment are absolutely obsessed with playing teachers, so they keep setting up schools, they take it in turns to be teachers, and they set out their own little lessons. I'll be honest, they're either a Miss Honey or a Miss Trunchbull, there's no in between, but they're really enjoying that at the moment. And I've often found that when that preparation feels playful rather than pressured, children are approaching transitions with far more confidence and emotional security. And importantly, that play allows children to remain emotionally in control of their experience. They can revisit it, pause it, repeat it, or change it depending on what they emotionally need in that moment. Because ultimately, preparation shouldn't increase the pressure, it should increase that security. So when they're taking that next step, it's done with more security. Um, so transitions can bring up conflicting feelings for children. And I think sometimes we underestimate, sorry, how emotionally complex those feelings can be. A child may feel excited and anxious at the same time. They might feel proud and worried, curious yet overwhelmed. And often children don't have the language to fully explain those emotions clearly. Let's face it, as adults, sometimes we don't even know how we're feeling. I've been asked before during bigger moments in my life how I'm feeling, and sometimes I can't even articulate that now. So we can understand how it can be difficult for children to do that. So part of our role is helping children to understand that these feelings are normal. It's okay to feel that, it's accepted. And sometimes that simply can look as like putting language around emotion gently without judgment. So you can we can say things like, you are allowed, it's okay to feel excited and nervous together. Or big changes can bring a lot of feelings. Or like, I wonder if that feels big for you. Sometimes that language can just help that security so they know that it's okay to have more than one feeling at once. And that reduces emotional overwhelm significantly when they feel, understood and accepted. I also think we need to be mindful not to unintentionally dismiss children's emotions within our reassurance. You often hear adults saying things like, you'll be fine, or don't worry. And while those responses can come from kindness, children can sometimes feel like their emotions are being hurried away rather than acknowledged. So instead, we can prioritize connection first. We can sit alongside children emotionally and let them know that those feelings make sense. Because children don't always need adults to remove the feeling. Sometimes they just need an adult simply willing to sit with them through it. Um, One thing I often come back to during transitions is the idea that we cannot remove uncertainty completely, as nice as it would be, wouldn't it? But we can increase emotional security, and familiarity plays such an important role in this. So simple things can make a really significant difference to children. So having things like transition books with photographs for children to look through, with maybe pictures of teachers or things they can access that are familiar from the school. Visiting the route to school. So if it's not something you normally do and you're able to, because I appreciate everyone's setups and where children may be going might be different, but maybe if there's a school that children are attending in your village or somewhere local to you, if you're able to have a little walk up so they can see the outside of the school, visual supports, familiar stories or predictable goodbye routines that you can start now, or maintaining consistency within daily routines wherever possible. I think it's often the small repeated rituals that become most regulating for children. Even something as simple as hearing like a good bye phrase each morning from parents can help children feel safer because it creates that predictability for them within an uncertain experience. And if you can start that ahead, even for children that are emotionally secure within your setting, it can help for transitions for a later period as they move on to the next stage. And I think something that's really important that we remember ourselves is children are not necessarily seeking perfection during transitions. They're just seeking that familiarity, that reassurance, and that feeling that somebody is walking alongside them throughout that change. Working in partnership with schools. So I've been doing some work recently on early years and school setting partnerships. And it's highlighted what I was already quite familiar with, that it very much depends on where you are, what the local schools are like, and how willing they are to engage, and how that school runs their transitions. No, I think strong transition practice is deeply relational, and one of the most valuable things we can do is to work closely with schools so children feel known before they arrive. I appreciate, obviously, that sometimes that's easier than other times, but I think wherever possible, we need to try and bridge the partnership there. Sometimes transitions can feel very abrupt for children because one minute they're within an environment where they're feeling secure, they recognize, they feel understood, and suddenly they're stepping out into something unfamiliar. And this is where that partnership working makes such a difference. Transition meetings, conversations with teachers, and sharing information about children's strengths, interests, emotional needs, and successful regulation strategies that you've experienced here that you can help the child with. Passing that information on all help create continuity for children and help with for the child and for the teachers to be able to step in and help that child in a way that's effective for them is really important. I appreciate again, it depends on the school, but even putting it down in writing so you can pass on as much information as you can, even if they're not prepared or not able to have telephone conversations or visits. I do think there's something incredibly powerful about teachers visiting children within familiar environments where possible. When children see future teachers within spaces they're already feeling emotionally safe, it suddenly becomes part of a familiar experience. But again, that depends on whether or not the teacher and the school are able to facilitate that. Um, Transitions are strongest when children feel known before they arrive, because ultimately children do not transition through paperwork or systems. They do transition through relationships. Um, but helping wherever we can to pass on that information makes a massive difference to the child. Supporting families through transitions. Anyone who's in this as a parent themselves will know that as parents, as families, we can obviously feel things emotionally as well. And I think sometimes we can forget just how emotionally significant these transitions can feel for families too, particularly for those with first-time school parents or anxious families or families whose youngest child starting school. The transition can hold a huge amount emotionally. For many parents, it's not simply a practical milestone. Emotionally, it can feel like the end of an era. And sometimes, if we're honest, it's actually the adults who can sometimes need holding emotionally through transitions just as much as the children, depending on the child and the adult, sometimes more. Um, Parents may be carrying anxiety, guilt, uncertainty, sadness, fear about whether or not the child will cope, or worries about letting go. And children are incredibly sensitive to the emotions around them. That doesn't mean that parents are causing difficulties. It simply reminds us how relational transitions are. And I think supporting families compassionately is such an important part of supporting the children as well. Regular communication, sharing photographs, home learning bags or transition packs, things like that can really help families um, through that. And also creating a space for families to just voice things without judgment. Sometimes families don't simply need reassurance that transitions take time, emotional responses are normal, that children don't need to be able to settle instantly in order for the transition to be successful. Because when families feel emotionally supported, children often feel safer too. So, I'd love for you just to reflect on this question yourself a moment. Just have a little think. Do you check back in with children when they transition to school? Because often transition work ends the moment children leave settings, but emotionally, the transition is still ongoing from that point. Some children may appear completely settled initially and then become emotionally overwhelmed weeks later once the permanence of that change begin to sink in. Others may hold everything together within school and release those emotions at home. And checking back in with families or schools can be incredibly valuable, not only for children, but for practitioners too. It helps us to reflect on how we've supported children, what we've done well, where children may still need emotional support, and what we can continue strengthening transition practice moving forward. Because I think it's always important that we reflect on our own practice to try and make transitions increasingly as smooth as possible for every child. I also think it's really important. It sends a really important message to all the families that we've obviously worked with, often for a very long time, that relationships don't just disappear because the child's moved on. A transition doesn't end from the moment that child walks out on the last day. Oops, sorry, I forgot I was meant to press a couple of buttons there. Sorry. Um, so, um, um, Oh, I think I was meant to go back. Sorry. Technical error here, guys. Um, I thought it might be helpful to bring together some practical ways that we can support children emotionally through school transitions here. And interestingly, a lot of these things are often very small, but it's often those small, consistent experiences that actually make the biggest difference emotionally. So preparing through play can be incredibly powerful. As we've mentioned, the use of uniforms, role play, things, small world, um, and those opportunities to revisit within your environment. Transition books, visual routines, school visits, or setting visits from with teachers if they're able to accommodate that. Predictable goodbye rituals and emotional check-ins can all help children feel safer and more prepared for what's ahead. Um, Reading stories about school, practicing independence naturally through everyday experiences. So allowing them the opportunities to have a go at things, particularly the sort of things that they will be experiencing when they go to school. And I think perhaps one of the biggest things we can offer during transitions is that emotional safety. Because when children are feeling emotionally safe, they're far more able to explore, engage, and eventually build the confidence within new environments as they move on. Okay, now I'm actually meant to be on this page. So, moving on to settling children into new settings. When we think about children starting at a new setting, our own settings, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that children settle because they learn routine. And whilst routines are incredibly important and absolutely do matter, I don't think it's routines that actually help children settle initially. Children settle through relationships. As adults, when we enter a new environment, we often look for the practical information first. We want to know where things are, what time things happen, who we need to speak to if we need help. But underneath that, we're also looking for connection, looking for signs that we belong. We're looking for people that make us feel confident and comfortable and feel understood. And children are exactly the same. A child can know where the toilet is and where to put the coat, or what happens at snack time, but still may not feel emotionally settled because settling isn't simply about understanding the environment. And whilst that is obviously important and those routines are, it's about feeling safe within it. Again, this links closely to the attachment theory and what we know about children needing emotionally available adults who are providing security during periods of uncertainty. When children are entering a new setting, they're not just learning routines, they're learning the people and they're asking themselves questions, even as you know, as young as little babies, they're wanting to know who can I trust? Who will help me and comfort me if I'm upset? Will someone notice if I need support? And as simple as, am I safe here? Is one of the biggest questions that they will be asking themselves. And often these questions aren't conscious, children aren't verbally asking them, but emotionally they're gathering all this information all the time. And that's right from birth. Children are asking that from their families, from their parents, from every caregiver that they come into contact with. So they're observing our tone of voice, noticing our facial expressions, they're watching how we respond when they make mistakes. They're learning whether their emotions are welcome and learning whether they matter within your space. And I think that's why relationships always sit at the heart of successful transitions because if children can fully engage with the environment around them, they need to feel safe and secure within the relationships that exist within inside of the environment. Because it doesn't matter whether you're, you know, within a home-based setting, wherever your setting is within the walls, or whether you're out in the garden, or if you're out exploring somewhere locally, or you know, a play group, they want to feel emotionally secure with the adults that are with them, as well as the environment. I often think back to children I've cared for who've settled beautifully, despite finding the initial transition difficult. And it wasn't because the environment was perfect. It wasn't because there was no tears. It wasn't because they instantly loved every aspect of the experience. It was because they found that connection. They found somebody who became their safe person, somebody who responded to them, who noticed them, who helped them feel emotionally held when everything else felt unfamiliar. That's what mattered. And when children have that secure base, something powerful happens because their confidence begins to grow, curiosity begins to emerge, and exploration increases. And that's when they're able to learn. So, one of the most powerful things we can do during transitions actually happens before a child's ever even walked through the door, because relationships don't begin on a child's first day, or at least they shouldn't. The more we know about a child before they start, the more emotionally responsive we can be from the very beginning, from the day that they enter our settings. And this is where conversations with families before they start become invaluable, because the families hold that knowledge, that no observation that we could do, assessment, or document could ever fully capture. They know what comforts their child when they're upset. They know what excites them, how to regulate them, what worries them. They have all that information. So wherever possible, having those building those relationships before they start is really important. Um, Home visits can be really incredibly powerful because they allow us to meet children within their secure base. We get to see them in an environment where they feel confident and relaxed and most themselves. For some children, that immediately reduces some of that uncertainty because we're then not a completely unfamiliar adult. And I think comfort objects deserve far more value than they sometimes receive. Sometimes even just a teddy or a blanket, or their mummy's t-shirt that the mummy slept in, so it's got their scent on. Those even things like a random object that seems um completely out there to us. I've had a child that loved a potato. They loved that potato, and it was a potato out of the kitchen that they'd just fallen in love with. Um, they can often act as an emotional bridge between home and setting, and can carry that familiarity, even when they're in unfamiliar spaces. Understanding routines matters too, not because we need to replicate every aspect of their home life, but they can hold emotional significance and provide that predictability and stability for them. Of course, then there's their interests. If a child is fascinated by dinosaurs, and we can bring in more dinosaurs to our setting to excite and invite them in, it can create that immediate connection. Children often build relationships through shared joy long before they're able to build it through conversation. And we also need to hear the family's voice. What are they hoping for? What are they worried about? What do they want us to know? Because when families feel listened to, children often feel safer too, and the family feels more comfortable and confident in leaving their child, which again, as we've mentioned, children um, pick up on their emotions and they can feel that, and that's replicated within their transition. Understanding the whole child. So I think one of the biggest mistakes we can make during transitions is assuming every child arrives at a new experience at the same starting point, because they don't. Every child's bringing their own history with them. They bring previous experiences, relationships, successes, challenges, and their emotional memories, even again from a young age. For example, a child who's experienced several positive separations may approach a new setting very differently to a child who's never been separated from their primary caregiver, or who have had a negative separation experience. A child who's experienced family changes like bereavement, divorce, moving house, some of those things that we discussed earlier, may already be carrying significant emotional load before that transition even begins. Even things like birth experiences, which are often overlooked, can sometimes form part of a child's story, particularly when those experiences have shaped parental anxiety or confidence. It's something I personally have on my transition forms, because those sort of things can have an impact. If a child was premature, if a parent had a negative birth experience or anxieties or PTSD or anything like that, that can impact on the child. We also need to consider sensory needs. Some children arrive into busy environments and feel immediately overwhelmed by noise, movement, stimulation, um, and what may look as reluctance to engage might actually be sensory overload. When we begin to understand the child as a whole and the whole family unit, we stop asking, why isn't the child settling? And instead begin asking what might the child need from us now. And I think that's a really important distinction into making positive transition experiences for children. I know we're coming up to 7:30. We might just run a teeny bit over, but I'm not too far from the end. So hopefully you're all able to stay that little bit longer, and apologies for running slightly over. Um, so supporting settling emotionally. If transitions are emotional experiences, then a settling in period needs to be emotional work rather than simply just practical work. And I think sometimes there can be pressure for children to settle quickly and immediately, and we can unintentionally measure success in how fast tears stop or how quickly the children are able to separate. But emotional settling isn't something that can be rushed. For many children, gradual settling works best because it allows that trust to build at their pace and at a pace that their nervous system can manage. Sometimes having shorter settling in sessions initially can reduce that emotional overload and can help children leave having had positive experiences that gradually build their confidence. Consistency is also incredibly important. The key person approach exists for that very reason. Um, I appreciate often as childminders, we have smaller settings. I know there might be some people in this group that have come from larger settings. Um, but having that one key person that a child can return to is incredibly important. That emotionally available adult that they can then have as their secure base before they then feel confident in exploring wider relationships and environments. Transitional objects also provide that comfort and continuity. And something I've found particularly powerful is using familiar songs, books, phrases, and even home languages where possible and where applicable. These things can communicate a really important message to children that you don't have to leave your identity at the door to belong here. I also personally, I'm level 4 Makaton trained, and I send videos home to parents so they can engage in that at home as well. And I know everybody will have their own routines, but maybe you can share some songs with families that you sing at the setting and they can sing them at home, or familiar stories that you guys enjoy reading. So then there is that sharing of information from setting to home, from both directions to help the child settle. Um, yes. So observations. So this is something I feel quite strongly about because often when children first enter new environments, we can become concerned if they're not immediately diving straight in and joining in with whatever's going on. We might see children sitting back, standing back, watching, observing, maybe wanting to stay really close to adults. And sometimes that can be interpreted as a problem, but observation is participation. Watching is learning. Um, Children are gathering information by doing that. They're working out who feels safe, learning expectations. They're observing social dynamics and making sense of a new world. In fact, many children need a period of observation before they feel ready to fully engage. And that's okay. I think of it like arriving at a party where you know nobody. Most adults wouldn't immediately walk into the middle of the room and start confidently engaging with everyone or start straight away dancing. We'd observe first, and children deserve that same grace. And I think that we need to remember that quiet children can sometimes be overlooked during transitions, and the child that's crying often receives that immediate support, but the child sitting quietly in the corner may actually be struggling just as much emotionally, even though they're not outwardly crying or showing that. Settling doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks quiet, and settling is very rarely linear. Children may seem settled one week and struggle the next. And the more we know children, the more we get to know them, the more we can see how a child expresses themselves and how to support them. But making sure that we are giving every child that same grace is really important. supporting families through transition. So we've already briefly spoken about supporting families through school transitions, and I think the same principle applies when children are settling into any new setting because parents transition too. And sometimes it's easy to forget that. For some families, leaving a child for the first time can feel incredibly emotional. I know when I left my children, I was incredibly emotional, and that I say that as a practitioner who's done this for a long time and knows that usually children settle, once parents have left. But it's still hard when you are leaving your child for the first time and you see them upset and you can't step in and fix it and you have to walk away. That is really difficult. And often parents are carrying all these feelings whilst trying to appear calm and positive for their child. And I think it's really important that we support them where we can. Um, Communication becomes a huge part of this. So sending photos, conversations, and sharing successes, and reassuring them help build trust. Strong transition practice. So as we begin drawing everything that we've discussed together, I think strong transition practice can be summed up in one central idea that transitions are a process, not an event. They don't begin on a start date and they don't end as soon as a child appears settled. Strong transition practice values continuity, relationships, and values emotional well-being. We've got to remain flexible because every child is different. Um, and we've got to remain attachment aware and begin it early. We also need to recognize that inclusion means adapting support to individual needs and not expecting every child to transition in the same way. I think, do I have another? So I've got some reflective questions on this slide that I would like you guys to just have a little think about, because I think we all need to reflect on how we do it. I'm constantly reflecting. And I'm just gonna, I decided to be a bit fancy and add some fancy come-ins on this bit. So I'd like you all to just have a little think about that, the questions listed here. Um, we need to think about what makes children emotionally safe, um, and how we can support them through transitions with these things. Because if we can answer every one of these questions honestly, we often find ourselves moving more towards compassionate and effective transition practice. And perhaps the message that I hope everyone leaves here today with is that children do not experience transition through policies, paperwork, timeline, or procedures. They experience it through our relationships. And when we place all these things at the center of our practice, transitions become something children can move through rather than simply have to endure. I'm going to just pop up some references for anyone who'd like to do any deeper reading into anything we've talked about today. The ones at the bottom are the new Best Start in Life things from the government, who have put together some information on supporting children through school readiness. So I'm going to ask Natalie if she'll stop recording there and we can go into any questions.